EU3D, Differentiation, Dominance, Democracy. The EU3D Differentiation, Dominance and Democracy project is funded by the European Commission as part of the Horizon 2020 programme. 50 researchers from 10 institutions across Europe spent 4 years working on the democratic potentials and the problems of dominance caused by differentiation in today's European Union. The transformation of the European Union has been remarkable, growing deeper and wider across a variety of member states, resulting in an increasingly differentiated European integration process. Recent developments have shown how vulnerable the EU is to volatile markets, geopolitical changes, and domestic opposition. EU3D specifies the conditions in which differentiation is politically acceptable, institutionally sustainable, and democratically legitimate. The research highlights the forms of differentiation that cause dominance, as well as providing important understanding of the conditions in which the EU's reforms may fail or succeed.
The general understanding and debate on differentiation in the European Union setting is about differentiated integration, which refers to exceptions, exemptions, and deviations from law. When we discuss or relate this to a democratic perspective, we need a broader understanding of differentiation, and EU3D introduces a more classical understanding of differentiation, which underlines that all political systems are differentiated, and that form of differentiation is much more conducive to the discussions on domination and democracy.
In Work Package 2, we were looking at the effects of differentiated integration on governance in the EU in the context of crises. We have found that in the process of managing the crises, the European Union has gone through a series of structural mutations. Some of them involve emergence of inherent dominance patterns in the governance system of the European Union. We have explored various ways as to how this has happened, what are the consequences, and of course, how can democratic reform be conducted?
Work Package 3 deals with the question of dominance in EU's external differentiated system. The question is, do we observe this kind of dominance in external differentiated systems such as the EU? And the answer is, it depends. It depends, of course, amongst other things, on the historical context, and it also depends on the policy area. With regard to a first result, we can say that voluntary submission is perceived by some countries and by some actors as dominance, and by others as an absolutely necessary tool. And we have observed that in the case of Brexit, in the case of Western Balkans, and in the case of enlargement. And the second big result of this work package is to compare different regional organizations, such as the EU, ASEAN, and Mercosur. And what we found out here is that differentiation leads in some areas to domination, and in some areas it doesn't. And this is particularly the case in Mercosur and ASEAN, and much less so with regard to Chinese influence in the EU.
In the frame of Work Package 3, the ELIAMEP team examined the case of EU enlargement in the Western Balkans. We did a study that examined how a structural condition of dominance emerged as an unintended consequence of the conditionality policy of the EU in the region, which undermined democratization reforms and the EU's credibility in the region.
Studying EU differentiation, dominance and democracy is impossible without taking perceptions of dominance into account. This is why EU3D included in Work Package 4 the perspective of the citizens, partially the media, and also partially parliaments. So we look at different discourses, public opinion data, and also how the media is reporting in different EU member states about EU integration and EU differentiation. What we find is that there is still quite some substantive national variation, and there's a lot of focus on European politics from a national perspective. But at the same time, we do see that European politics has gained in salience, thus it has become more important in national media discourses on the EU.
Within Work Package 5, Future of Europe debates, the group of researchers were focusing on analyzing the debate that was happening in Europe between 2015 and 2022 and devoted to the future of the integration. Firstly, we conceptualized the potential constitutional models, constitutional narratives for the future of Europe. We distinguish intergovernmental, federal, and cosmopolitan regional narratives. In addition, after mapping the proposals, we also conceptualized new narrative called sovereignist. Secondly, we built a database, which nowadays consists of more than 1,000 proposals gathered in different national settings on the European level, made by different actors, in which they propose scenarios for future Europe. Finally, we also zoomed in into specific actors and citizens. For instance, we mapped how civil society organizations devoted to migration, women's organizations, as well as citizens perceive the future of Europe and what constitutional narratives they are preferring.
We're working specifically on the question of the transformation of the new rights within 4 countries, Italy, France, Poland, and Hungary. And we call this transformation of the new radical rights sovereignism. These parties accept to remain within the European Union after Brexit. The cost of Brexit was so high that it was absolutely difficult for them to risk to enter in this independence process. So we try to understand how they adapted, how they try to endogenize nationalism within the European integration project.
From the conference about the future of Europe to the European Parliament elections of 2024, the EU3D project hopes to provide a framework of analysis of the interaction between democracy, dominance, and differentiation. This would not have been possible without engaging with the broad set of policy stakeholders. On one hand, through an active dialogue with the advisory board, a policy network, and other stakeholders, the viewpoints and experiences of critical stakeholders have been feeding into academic discussions. Secondly, the EU3D also informed public debates about the future design of the EU through a series of public events and outreach activities to give citizens a better understanding of the conditions for and the limitations of the European Union integration. And then thirdly, last but not least, a series of policy papers have condensed the recommendations towards policymakers.
More information on the project's research and publications can be found on its website, www.eu3d.uio.no.